Greetings and welcome to another patch notes video here at Words About Games, and today I want to talk about Othercide, a recently released tactical strategy game set inside an Evanescence album that has provided me with one of the most memorable experiences I've had with a game all year. Or at least this side of The Last of Us Part 2, that game was pretty memorable. So much so that I've decided to skip making a straight impressions video for the game because a straight up critical analysis of the game's mechanics, art, music, and whatnot wouldn't do justice to the weird and wonderful journey I went on during my first few hours with it. I've managed to love this game, hate this game, and be utterly bewildered by this game, sometimes simultaneously. So instead of breaking the game down in a succinct and concise manner, I thought I'd instead write something akin to a diary of my first 5 or so hours in the game's world. Othercide is a really weird game to try and critically analyse. I'm not talking about the fact that its aesthetic, soundtrack, enemy design, story, or general tone all feel like they fell out of the imagination and fevered drawings of someone from the early 2000s who listened to Nightwish on repeat, though I do want to talk about all of those things later in the video. It's a strange one because my opinions of the first few hours of this game varied so incredibly wildly that I've mentally written several variations of this video, both scathing of the game and showering it with praise. Some moments I've disliked the game incredibly, where others I've been convinced of its excellence. Sitting down to recollect my thoughts on playing through some of Othercide, the truth probably lies somewhere in the middle, but I definitely want to talk through those crazy first few hours and why my opinion of the game was so volatile. So strap in, I guess. My very first impression of the game was great, thanks to its aforementioned presentation. As soon as I opened the game up, I knew it was going to be something that would tap into my love for early 2000s gothic aesthetic. I'd seen trailers and screenshots of the game before, so I knew that Otherside's art style looked fantastic, but seeing a frozen image of some of the game's characters and the game's wonderful grayscale artistic style was great. The only colour in Othercide is red, of course, because that's the colour of blood. It's heavily stylistic and awesome. It was also helped by the menu music, which is an absolute banger of a song that feels like it fell straight out of the early 2000s. It's called Soul Swap. It's a collaboration by several artists. As a side note, the game's entire soundtrack is brilliant, available for streaming on Spotify, and I totally didn't stop writing this video for 5 minutes to listen to the theme again. I actually paused at the menu to listen to the song all the way through before hitting the game. So far, I was loving Othercide, and I hadn't even gotten past the start menu, which I thought was a good sign for the rest of the game. When you start the game for the first time, you're thrown into a tutorial section of the game that introduces the basic mechanics and the overarching narrative. A character called the Mother is making a fairly desperate last stand against a seemingly never-ending wave of kind of freaky demons that definitely probably want to end the world. The opening level ends with the Mother directly addressing the player before making a heroic sacrifice when a creepy as all hell demon child shows up and taunts her, which sets the rest of the game in motion. This is where you're thrown into the game proper for the first time. The Mother is still sort of with you, or maybe you're playing as the Mother. I'm not entirely sure how it works. She's definitely sacrificed herself because you can't send her into battle anymore, which is a shame because she had some really powerful abilities. But it's okay, she gives birth to some daughters that form the basis of your first squad in the game. You get 3 daughters, each a different class with ironic names like Peace or Harmony, and they're who you send out into the void to murder the many monsters who would definitely probably try and end the world. Or what's left of it. Again, I'm not really sure what's going on with the story, but it's fine, because it's all incredibly goth metal, and I'm really digging the tone and atmosphere that Othercide is setting up. Like, if I was listening to a concept album by someone like Lacuna Coil, I might actually imagine something that resembles Othercide. So far, so great. There was just one small problem. The tutorial for the game had done an absolutely terrible job explaining how the game actually worked. It was really heavy-handed and had gone into incredibly dense detail about how its mechanics had worked, but it had done so using very specific mechanics as examples. Mechanics that related to a character who had died at the end of the tutorial, a character with abilities and a playstyle that didn't match any of my 3 daughters that I had now. The result of this was that when I deployed into my first mission, I didn't really have any idea what on earth was going on or what I was doing. Maybe I'd been too distracted by how awesome the music and art and general gothness of the game was. But I was staring at this tactics game without any real clue how it all worked. By some combination of dumb luck and a lot of past experience with tactics games, I managed to just about kill all the monsters and get out of the first mission alive. And though I didn't really know how I managed to win, even I knew it had been an incredibly sloppy fight. And then came the second mission, an ambush, which, as it turns out, is actually impossible if you don't have a grasp of some of Othercide's basic gameplay mechanics, like how its timeline works, or why it's a good idea to make sure your characters don't ever take damage. The result was an incredibly swift and brutal defeat as my daughters very swiftly fell under a never-ending wave of monsters. They'd entrusted me with their lives, which was highly unfortunate for them. Hopefully their deaths were swift and painless, but looking at the game, I imagine they were actually suffering endlessly. And I still feel a little bit bad about that. But Othercide is a roguelike. Death is not just difficult to avoid, it's to be expected. Though I imagine the mother expected her daughters to die heroically in glorious combat, not because they were stuck in the wrong corner surrounded by monsters, because the idiot directing them didn't have a clear grasp of how the fundamental mechanics of the game worked yet. Again, I do feel a bit bad about that. But Othercide didn't care. I suffered a TPK, so the game booted me back to the beginning to start a new recollection, which is what Othercide calls its runs. It was at this point of my playthrough that I almost abandoned Othercide completely. I had been sent a review card, so I was under no particular obligation to cover it. I could just walk away, not make a video, and no one would ever know. Now, that's not because I necessarily dislike the game, but when I spend half an hour fumbling through a game with no clear idea what I'm doing wrong, I tend to conclude that maybe a game isn't for me. It happens sometimes. I've picked up plenty of games I've never covered on YouTube because they weren't for me, and I felt like it'd be unfair for me to cast a critical eye over them because my opinion boiled down to it's probably a good game, but I personally can't get into it. But I like tactics games. And the art and the music was seriously excellent. I honestly think the sole reason I decided to play another run was because I was staring at the menu, and Soul Swap is seriously just that good of a theme song. And my integrity as a games critic to give a game a fair chance or whatever, but mostly it was probably just the song, which I totally didn't go off and listen to again instead of recording the next portion of this video, just so I'm clear on that. So I went back for more. I unlocked a memory, which gave me a slight buff for my second run that I could unlock using the minuscule amount of currency I gained from my doomed first attempt. I also noticed that if I went into the graveyard I could see the names of the 3 daughters I had foolishly led to their deaths, their epitaphs taunting me with my past failure. Which was great. Thanks, Othercide. Maybe it was the fact that I had started completely fresh, free from the game's original tutorial, that I hadn't managed to absorb because of the density of the information it was presenting to me, tied to a character I was never going to use again. But as I launched my 3 new daughters into their first couple of missions, I started to get a grasp on how the game worked. Of course, it could also be that in my second recollection, I wasn't almost immediately thrown into a Kobayashi Maru against endless waves of enemies that I needed to fight off while I waited for an extraction point to unlock too far away from my daughters to ever reach without getting epically murdered by an unstoppable army of demons? I'm not actually sure. The overarching bad guy is called the Suffering, which I guess is more a vague term than an overall antagonist. But it does sound badass, and 100% fits the tone and aesthetic the game is going for. When given a run at the game on my own terms, and without hitting a masochistically difficult challenge, I was able to start to understand the game's mechanics, both those that were familiar to me and those that weren't. There's some pretty standard stuff in here if you've played a tactics game or roguelike before. Each of your characters is one of 3 different classes, specialised in different types of abilities. The Soul Slinger specialises in ranged combat, the Blade Master deals massive melee damage, and the Shield Bearer tanks enemies and can manipulate the timeline by delaying enemy attacks. These characters level up, gain stat boosts, and unlock new abilities. Some of these abilities even use health instead of action points, which I'll explain more fully in a moment. One of the big features of Othercide is that you can't heal your daughters at all between fights or even in them. There's no healing items or abilities to speak of, unless you sacrifice one daughter to heal another of equal or lower level, bringing their health back up and bestowing a small bonus to them based on the sacrifice daughter's stats at the time. It's a really grim but really fascinating mechanic, having to choose between healing one daughter by potentially sacrificing another who might be one of your best fighters. And it's one of the only meaningful choices you'll have to make in the game, so it makes sense that it's such a doozy. While I never say I went as far as getting attached to any individual daughter as a character, like, say, with the soldiers in XCOM, it still sucked having to kill off one of my higher level and incredibly useful daughters to heal another to give myself a better shot at surviving the next fight. The other major feature of the game is the timeline. Othercide is a turn-based tactics game, but the turns don't quite work how you'd think they do. Each character has a pool of 100 action points per turn. Moving and using attacks and abilities costs a portion of this AP. If you spend 50 AP or less, your character's next turn will take place in the middle of the timeline. Spend more and you'll enter burst mode, allowing you to do more in a turn, but meaning that your character's next turn will start at the end of the timeline, much later, and ensuring that everyone else gets a turn in the interim. There's a lot of depth to this system. It creates a fascinating balancing act of risk versus reward, figuring out whether it's better for your daughters to act more frequently or not. You can always see when enemies will act next on the timeline, or when delayed attacks, which are generally more powerful, are due to go off. You've got all the information you need to make some pretty tough decisions. Success rests on a knife edge on the other side, and one wrong move can leave you opening to devastating consequences. Once I wrapped my head around how the game worked, I started to really enjoy my time with it. After one disastrous first run and a second run that gave me the breathing room I needed to actually learn how to play the game, I felt fairly confident in my ability to navigate the game's tough combat scenarios. I'd learned about the timeline, some strategies that seemed to work quite well, and how to parse all of the information that was available at my fingertips. And then I hit day 7 and it was time to fight the first boss, the surgeon. Friends, to say that I lost this fight would not do justice to just how readily and swiftly defeated I was. Even to say that the fight was one-sided still doesn't feel like enough. The surgeon and its caretakers so thoroughly destroyed me in one of the most hilariously one-sided combat encounters in video game history that I'm surprised the scale of the loss hadn't caused the game to uninstall itself from my PC while my Steam account deleted itself, my hard drive self-destructed, and the developers tweeted at me to make sure that I was okay. It was humbling. I'd spent 7 in-game days building up my confidence, getting a grasp on the mechanics, and feeling like I had a chance at any encounter I was likely to come across. And then I met the surgeon. My first encounter with Father Gascoigne hadn't ended so badly. When I clicked the option to start the third recollection, I half expected the game to ask if I was sure I wanted to continue, or if I needed another minute to recover from the shell shock of the beating I had just taken. I had unlocked some more new memories, as well as the currency to equip them, that would allow me some pretty helpful buffs into the next recollection, including being able to resurrect one of my fallen daughters. The game would even let me skip straight to the boss fight, though when I hovered over the option I heard air raid sirens and distant screams, and when I regained my senses, it was 20 minutes later and I had the faintest taste of copper in my mouth. So I figured I'd best not do that. I'd love to say I have even more amusing anecdotes about Othercide, but from this point on, I kind of found myself having what I would consider a normal time with the game. Those first 2 runs will live on in infamy for me as some of the most memorable experiences I've had with the game in 2020. But from the third recollection onwards, I think I had the more typical Othercide experience, which is that of a pretty fun roguelike tactics game that maybe leans a bit too heavily on grinding out new memories that allow you enough of an advantage to tackle the challenges that lie before you, and it could probably do with a bit more mission and enemy variety. The core tactics gameplay is really satisfying once you actually understand how it works, and some of the game's unique twists, such as sacrificing daughters for healing or how the timeline works in combat, are really clever. The art and music are absolute winners, though. This game is so nice to look at, and the soundtrack has already entered my Spotify rotation. I'd recommend it to anyone who likes tactics games or goth rock, or both. Just make sure you're paying particularly close attention during the tutorial, and watch out for the surgeon. Thanks very much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it or found it useful, consider sticking around here at Words About Games. Our content includes review impressions of games big and small, a weekly podcast dedicated to discussing the happenings in and around the games industry, weekly opinion videos, reactions, debate-driven top 5 and top 10 lists, a regular Hall of Fame series where we discuss our favourite games, and indie game spotlights. We also stream every Friday and Saturday at twitch.tv/wordsaboutgames. Most importantly, have a brilliant day.